Iran and Saudi Arabia are to resume diplomatic relations in a deal brokered by China, which took the world by surprise. It's been welcomed across the Middle East and internationally, but not in Israel. So, what are the implications of the agreement in the region and beyond? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Iran and Saudi Arabia are to restore diplomatic relations in an unexpected development between two powerful adversaries, entrenched on opposite sides on a host of issues and fighting in proxy wars, notably in Yemen, Syria and Lebanon. Few would have believed even days ago that a rapprochement between the two was about to happen. The US wasn't involved in the deal in a region where it would see itself as the dominant superpower. China brokered the secret Saudi-Iran negotiations with the announcement of the successful outcome made in Beijing.
China has provided favorable conditions for reaching the agreement. This is a vivid demonstration of the basic policies and concepts of China's diplomacy, which includes the major initiative of building a community with a shared future for mankind.
I strongly believe that under the guidance of the aforementioned diplomatic policies and concepts, China will constantly play an important role in promoting international and regional peace and stability.
I think this deal sends very clear signals to the world. First, there is not only the Ukraine crisis, but also many other issues that are related to peace and people's livelihood, which should be brought to the attention of all parties and need to be dealt with in a timely and appropriate manner. The second signal is that no matter how complex the issue is and how acute the challenges are, as long as we sit down in a spirit of mutual respect and engage in equal dialogue, we'll be able to find a mutually acceptable solution to a problem. I think the third signal is that the Middle East belongs to the people of the Middle East, and the fate of the region should be in the hands of its people.
Well, we'll be discussing the implications of the deal in a moment with our guests, but first let's find out what the public reaction's been in Tehran, from where Ali Hashim reports.
The agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia caught many in surprise here in Tehran. The political polarization over the past years placed Saudi Arabia third to no one but Israel and the United States in the level of enmity, and sometimes ahead of them. And that's why political elites received the news in different ways, though they were positive about it, but framing the whole development was read in different ways. In conservative newspapers, for example, they saw this as a slap to the US and Israel, while moderate and reformists saw it as the end of a deadlock or the beginning of a wave of peace. But regardless of how it was framed, expectations aren't high because many believe this was a deal between security officials, and it's yet for politicians to start their dialogue. And mainly when it comes to politics, it's where complications lie. And that's why Iranians and Saudis are to take big decisions. The level of tension between the two countries, the conflicting interests between the two countries, the media war that's been waging for the past 7 years between the two countries. These are all issues that are going to be discussed. These are all compromises on the table that could be and could not be taken by both countries. The stakes are very high, and everyone knows that, and therefore, as we said, expectations aren't high. For Inside Story, Ali Hashim in Tehran.
Let's bring in our guests then for today's discussion. Fouad Izzadi is Associate Professor at the University of Tehran. He joins us now via Skype from Doha. Hilary Mann-Leverett is the CEO at the political risk consultancy Strategia. She joins us now via Skype from McLean, Virginia in the United States. Also via Skype from Doha, Ibrahim Freihat, conflict resolution specialist and author of the book Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict. A warm welcome to you all. Ibrahim, let's start with you. They've been on the slow burn for the past 2 years. What are your thoughts then on the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the fact that it was China that facilitated the rapprochement, despite years of talks, mainly in Iraq?
Yeah, I think it's about time that we are seeing this kind of development. And I think the timing, there are three reasons that explain the timing now, despite the five talks that they had in Iraq, but did not produce anything in the past. But we're seeing this now materializing in this kind of agreement. Now, the first reason is, I believe it's related to Iran's latest development on its nuclear activities and the enrichment of uranium to 83%, which is considered almost crossing the nuclear threshold, which has triggered much closer military collaboration between Israel and the United States and the possibility of attacking Iran. So Iran wanted to neutralize some potential players in the region like Saudi Arabia and be prepared in a strategy in order to respond to nuclear development or a possible attack in the future. So this, from Iran's perspective, this became an important step to take. Now, for Saudi Arabia has, we have seen a pattern of frustration working with the Biden administration over the past 2 years, which led Saudi Arabia to diversify its security partners and work with other players. We have seen this in the voting in the UN on the Ukraine war, and not taking the position that the United States wanted to take, and the increase or the Saudi's reaction to the energy needs that it decreased through OPEC, the production level that the U.S. was in desperate need for it. So the Saudis looking at the East also to diversify. I think this also links to China, where China came right time, right moment, right place, is to work with Iran and Saudi Arabia, especially because China has become in a difficult position where having to choose between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And China found that the only solution to this is to bring the two parties together in order to maintain its economic interest with the Gulf region and Iran at the same time. And for that, we are seeing China stepping outside its traditional role and playing an international mediator between the two countries. And it was successful. It worked for all three parties.
Hillary, where does this leave the United States? Will the Biden administration now be forced to reevaluate its standing in the region, with China obviously rising as a diplomatic and strategic player in the Gulf?
Yes, you know, here in Washington, and I think throughout the United States, Americans view the United States as the indispensable power on the world stage and the indispensable power in the Middle East. What happened yesterday with the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, is that China really almost took that spot. It made themselves, China is now really the indispensable power in the Middle East. That's just a fact. China has the money, it has the diplomacy, it has the wherewithal to become the indispensable player. And so in Washington, there's really, there's surprise. I don't think the Biden administration was ready for this development. I think there's concern that the Israelis were surprised. We saw Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu quote unquote backgrounding reporters, but everybody here knows that it was Netanyahu, criticizing the Biden administration directly, that it was Biden's weakness toward the Middle East that enabled this deal. So in Washington today, there's a lot of consternation, surprise, and concern about what the path is forward for U.S. power in the Middle East and even more broadly around the world.
Fawad, I'll come to you in just a moment, but I saw Ibrahim shaking his head there while Hillary was talking. Ibrahim, what were you disagreeing with there?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes, I disagree. I don't think China, we should rush into conclusion to assume that China has abandoned its more neutral role in international conflicts. China had to take this action because it became under tremendous pressure, having to choose between Iran and Saudi Arabia in terms of its economic interest. China has a trade relations with trade volume with the Gulf of $130 billion. And also it receives 36% of its energy supplies from the Gulf. And Ibrahim Raisi was the Iranian president a few weeks ago was visiting China, and he had protest over the military collaboration between China and Saudi Arabia, especially on ballistic missiles. So China became under tremendous pressure, did not want to give up neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And for that reason, purely for economic interest,
Hillary,
by China had to broker this and to try to get an intention. And I think it's still prematurely to say that China is changing its international behavior.
Hillary, what was it you wanted to say?
My colleague makes very, very good points. The key issue here is the United States could not have made this deal. The United States simply couldn't. The United States doesn't have the relationship with Iran to make this kind of deal. That makes the United States not the indispensable country in terms of conflict resolution. And we saw China at the same time really go on a diplomatic offensive throughout Europe and with Ukraine. Now China's ability to broker big deals in the Middle East and elsewhere is really center stage, and the United States is not. So while I agree with my colleague on many of his points, I do not think China is giving up its neutrality. But I think the neutrality that China has championed, along with its money and its diplomatic wherewithal, is really putting China center stage. Yes, it's under pressure, but it's their power and their agility to have relations with all countries that now makes them the indispensable nation, not the United States.
Fawad,
and that's what worries people here in Washington.
Yeah, Fawad, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Tell us what this restoration of ties means there in Iran. The country appears to have successfully pushed back against regional isolation without having to make any major changes to policies. Are the country's hardliners and moderates in agreement on this restoration of diplomatic ties?
I think they are. Iran never considered Saudi Arabia an enemy. It was unfortunate that the Saudis considered Iran to be an enemy. They spent a lot of money and resources on fighting Iran for the last number of years. And it's good news that finally the Saudis have realized that that wasn't a good policy. And the fact that we have this agreement and the hope that the agreement is actually implemented results in people in Iran and in Saudi Arabia basically winning. There is no reason for the two countries that are neighbors to have this type of confrontation. So we have Iran as a winner. We have the Saudis as a winner. As our colleagues mentioned, China is winning, obviously. And the Israelis are losing. The Israeli foreign policy has been the policy of divide and conquer. They wanted to have all the neighboring countries of Iran fighting Iran. That's not really working out. And the United States, after the assassination of General Soleimani in Iraq, we had the New York Times reporting that the Trump administration feared that the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia were going to succeed. General Soleimani was in charge of those talks. And one reason they assassinated him was because they were afraid that Iran and Saudi Arabia will normalize relations. Administration is not.
I just wanted to ask you whether one of Iran's main motivations for normalizing ties with Saudi Arabia is that it could possibly expect, after such a deal, for Saudi Arabia to invest in the country, and thereby Iran would circumvent US-led efforts to isolate the country economically through sanctions.
Yes, I think that would be a hope. In the text of the agreement that was signed in Beijing yesterday, there were references to an agreement that was made in the 1990s, basically both sides trying to increase economic cooperation. So that is something that Iran is hoping. There is no reason for this type of tension. Iran could have the type of relations that has with Qatar, for example. Iran's relations with Oman, these are normal relations, there are economic exchanges, there are academic exchanges, cultural exchanges. There is no reason that Saudis cannot engage in the same type of relations with Iran, the same way Iran is engaging with Qatar and Oman and a number of other regions of the states. So I think people in Saudi Arabia realize that the previous policies were not really paying off. It's very difficult to pressure Iran, and they can get more out of the relations by normalizing relations instead of demonizing the other side.
Ibrahim, I mean, it's early days yet, but could this deal spark a domino effect, do you think, across the region? What are its implications for Yemen, for Lebanon, and for the Iran nuclear deal?
In conflict resolution, we said that the real success is not in signing an agreement, but in implementing the agreement. So while signing this agreement in China is definitely an important step, and it's a good step towards reducing tension in the region, in the Middle East, in the Arab world. However, the real success is in trying to implement this, and the agreement being reflected on the foreign policy behavior of the two countries, and particularly Iran. Now, in principle, in theory, we are expecting to see tension reduction, particularly in Lebanon, in Syria to a certain extent, and also in Yemen and in Iraq, because these four countries in particular, where we had a serious proxy conflict or proxy war between the two countries, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, happening for the past few years. Whether this is guaranteed or not, I don't think we need also to jump into conclusion and assume that these problems will disappear, because there are many challenges that facing the implementation of this. And one major challenge actually is the role of Israel and the United States. And I agree with the colleague who said that Israel emerged as the biggest loser in this agreement, because this is going to affect its plans to normalize with Saudi Arabia to a certain extent, while the United States is looking hopefully that this agreement will end the war in Yemen, but also it has other important effects for the U.S. role in the region. In order of, this is traditionally a territory for the United States, the Gulf. Now, China is the one who is making the call there. So at the same time, and that's why I think we need to be careful, this agreement about the implementation, this agreement, while it restores diplomatic relations between the two countries and emphasizes non-interference in internal affairs, at the same time, the problem or the conflict between Iran and the U.S. and Israel has not been resolved. And for that reason, Iran will always need, from its own perspective, its armed militias in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And for that reason, so the armed militias, which is a serious problem for Saudi Arabia, they're not going to disappear. Iran is not going to dismantle its armed militias in the region. And this is, again, historically has been a key concern for Saudi Arabia, because, again, from Iranian perspective, Iran needs those militias in a possible confrontation with Iran and with the U.S. and Israel. So I think we need to be careful about how much to expect. I think it's the proxy role where the two countries supported different parties. This is something we can expect to see some quietness, possibly where Houthis attack on Saudi land. I think such thing we are going to see disappearing. In Lebanon also, we can see some tension, but it's not going to solve all the region's problems.
Hillary, if Israel had wanted to form an Arab alliance against Iran, this restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia appears to have poured cold water on that. What are the implications? You touched on it a few minutes ago, but what are the implications of this deal for Israel in particular?
Well, there's actually some debate about that in Washington right now. There's, on one hand, the concern that U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was just in the Middle East. He was just in Israel, in Egypt, and he thought the Defense Department, the Biden administration here, thought that they were continuing to work with Israel to try to have this Israel-Arab alliance against Iran, and that coming together against Iran would be the glue that would bring these countries, especially Israel and Saudi Arabia, together. Clearly, that is not the case. And that's something that came to some surprise, if not shock, not only to the Biden administration, but people here in Washington. Especially concerned are those what I would call pro-Israel hawks here in Washington. They see this as an absolute loser for U.S. interests, for Israeli interests, and it leaves the Israelis with a real question mark over what their strategy will be vis-a-vis the Saudis, the region, and even internally. However, given that, there are some in Washington who think maybe it'll be easier for Israel now to have a normalized relationship with Saudi Arabia. They look at the example, the precedent of what happened with the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates was able to reconcile with Iran at the same time that it entered into what became known as the Abraham Accords, and they now have a very deep relationship with Israel. So there are some here that think the Israelis could do that. Now that Saudi Arabia has quieted its relationship with Iran, it gives it a little bit more room to maneuver, perhaps even to formalize with Israel. So there is some debate, but on the whole, the pro-Israel hawks here in Washington and the Biden administration are very concerned about this development for what it means for relations in the Middle East, and especially for what it means for China's power on the world stage.
Fouad, coming back to what Ibrahim was saying a few moments ago about Iran's militia, would Iran, after this deal, now fully expect to be brought in from the cold, if you like, in its own backyard, in this region?
Well, I disagree with the term Iran's militias. We have the Yemenis that are fighting an invasion from a neighboring country. I'm here in Doha attending a conference on Russia's war on Ukraine. If Russia should be condemned for attacking Ukraine, it's difficult to see why Saudi attack on Yemen should be supported by the United States, and billions of dollars worth of weapons are sold to the Saudis for that war. So the Yemen is an independent country. Yemen is a very old country. The people in that country asked for Iran's help, and Iran has tried to support these people in a similar manner that we have a number of countries that are supporting Ukraine. These people in Yemen, have their own foreign policy, have their own government. They are not Iran's militia. They are not Iran's proxies. These are people who asked Iran to help them because of the difficulties that they have. Okay. And Iran did. But they have said many times that they don't want Iran to negotiate on their behalf. This is not how Iran operates in the region. Iran has friends, not proxies. And if someone doesn't understand that very fact, I don't think they can manage to realize what's going on in this part of the world.
Hillary, Saudi Arabia has been deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program. To what extent will this normalization of ties have to address that, do you think? With the P5+1 talks appearing, at least, to be going nowhere for the moment, and given the fact that those talks didn't fully address the concerns of key countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel, could Iran's nuclear program now, you think, be addressed with China, perhaps, as a broker, and that the P5+1 talks are dead?
Well, China is very interested in doing so. They've made that quite clear. And now they have proven that they have the diplomatic offices, the platform, the wherewithal to address important issues around the world, perhaps even Iran's nuclear program. Though I doubt that China will focus just on Iran's nuclear program to single Iran out in a negative, bad way. I think they'll probably look at it more in terms of the context for security cooperation in the region. And perhaps China will use its platform with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Iran is now a full member, and Saudi Arabia has applied for membership. Perhaps they will use that as a more multilateral cooperative platform to address issues like that. But I think the other key issue involving Saudi Arabia, which is very, very important in the United States, is that Saudi Arabia is now focused less on Iran's nuclear program and more on its own. What it has made clear is that it wants the United States to give it the green light, to give Saudi Arabia the green light to build out its nuclear program and for it to have a full nuclear cycle with full enrichment. That would be a tremendous development that may not be so positive for the region and could potentially augur a new kind of arms race in the region, and something that the U.S. administration is seriously considering. It would be a dramatic change in policy.
Ibrahim, I've got about a minute and a half left of the program here. The one thing this deal does show us is that Saudi Arabia is determined to conduct a foreign policy independent of the West. What are the implications of that?
First of all, I think we need to take into consideration that this policy became very clear with the arrival of the Democratic Party in power, especially the Biden administration and their frustration with dealing with Biden over the past years. Let's remember that Biden was the vice president when in 2015 the U.S. signed a nuclear agreement with Iran and threw Saudi Arabia under the bus without consideration. So there is a long history of a frustration from Saudi Arabia with the Biden administration in power. For that reason, I think we are seeing a pattern now that where Saudi Arabia is diversifying. It's now proposing Saudi Arabia to itself to play a role in mediating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. And also, it has not voted in favor of the U.S. Now we are seeing increased collaboration with China. I think this is a pattern. This is not just something that's going to disappear. Even if the Biden administration changes in the next election in 2024, and I think the U.S. should accommodate to this new reality that the Gulf is no longer a monopoly of its security.
Ibrahim, there I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us. Fouad Azadi, Hilary Mann-Leverett and Ibrahim Freihat. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website that's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.